to the last general seminar of the year. I think Jeremy Varon is a wonderful choice for the general seminar. The general seminar, which is going now, I don't know, 80 years, something like that. The whole difficulty of the general seminar is to figure out what we really want to retain from the past that is critical and put it together with what is new that is also critical. So it's constantly changing form of adaptation, and I think Jeremy exemplifies this. He comes, first of all, his background is a mixture of Turkish and German Jewish, and here are, two groups that are struggling with the whole...
But it's Turkish, Jewish, and German.
Turkish, I think Turkish
is... Key distinction.
That's very important. No, I didn't. So I naturally assumed that it was German Jewish. So that's very interesting. German Lutheran and Turkish Jewish. He's the founder of the journal, The 60s, which is an important resource for all of us. So, first of all, historicizing the 1960s, he's a friend of many people from the 60s, but he's an activist of today. So he bridges these two generations. His first book, which we don't have here, Bringing the War Back Home, is a comparison of the American weathermen, the would-be terrorist or actual terrorist organization of the American New Left and Red Army faction from Germany. And this is really interesting in terms of bringing out, first of all, taking a crucial moment, namely during what is felt to be a revolutionary movement, how to change, how to adapt, how to self-reflect. And the Americans were able to do it, and the Germans were not. And the book is situated at this moment when the New Left is disappearing in the 1970s. The anti-war movement is disappearing, and the Weathermen feel an allegiance, especially to Black America, and they pursue a terrorist path, but they're able to self-correct to a great extent. And the Germans are caught up in the post-Nazi moment, and they are not. They continue into the 80s and so forth, using violence and terrorism. And his contemporary book, which he's going to talk about today...
No, I'm not.
Oh, you're not?
No. I'm talking about something entirely different. But
I had no idea.
But mention the book.
Okay, well, I'll just mention the book. I didn't even know what you're talking about, so I'll just mention the book. I thought you were talking about the book. So, this book is The New Life, Jewish Students of Post-War Germany, and it's likewise a kind of very remarkable and telling moment in the history of the 60s and the New Left. This is a study of a group of students, Jewish students.
Eli, it deals with the immediate post-war period. It has nothing to do with the 60s.
Right. This is, but it's similar in that it's a study of a group of Jewish students who decide to stay in Germany and attend the university with their previous persecutors, and as opposed to going to Israel. And it deals with the question of how important their past as Jews are and how they deal with that, what Jeremy calls existential restoration, the process by which they come to grips with the past, the element of memory, the element of forgetting, reconstitution of their identities in this traumatic situation.
Very good. Thank you. Okay, first off, thanks to everybody for coming out on like such a beautifully, sunny day, like the relative view, the crowd, and I'm so, grateful that you paid me the honor of showing up. Okay, so to explain briefly the provenance of the talk, it's an adaptation from a talk I did recently at Brown University, and then I was honored to be invited to give the keynote address of a graduate student conference of the history students. And then that's the good news. And the bad news is that, like a lot of graduate student conferences, the theme was so unbelievably broad. They were about borders or power or contingency. And then this one was broad. It was about subject and structure. So I thought, oh dear, I better say something big that's original, but at the same time historically rooted, grounded in expertise, and then legible to non-experts. So what I put together is a sort of drive-by history of the self in the 1960s in a very deliberate way, invoking a lot of the iconic history of the 60s themselves, again, in a way that should become sort of strategically apparent to you. So I'm going to dive into it. It's sort of an old-school 45-minute talk, but with a fun PowerPoint that was almost as arduous as writing the paper itself. So hopefully I can hold your interest. Okay. Asked in 1969 his latest thinking on human freedom, Jean-Paul Sartre answered, "The idea I've never ceased to develop is that in the end, one is always responsible for what is made of one. This is the limit I would accord to freedom, the small movement in which makes of a socially conditioned being someone who does not render back what his conditioning has given him." I begin with this quote for several reasons. First, it intimately connects with the broad mission of the talk, to interrogate the relationship between subjectivity, suggesting autonomy and agency, and structure as both the genesis of subjectivity and its constraint. Second, I very much like the conclusion, much better to live with at least the illusion of freedom than an acute consciousness tending towards resignation of all that imperils it. Related, Sartre's thoughts push back against the totalizing negativity of the discourse so in vogue when I came of age in the late 1980s. At the time, the strongest wisdom held that the subject was merely an effect of structure or discourse. Free will and its humanist predicates were shibboleths, as the very notion of the self had been produced through such means as the introjection of the gaze of disciplinary authority. New theories rejecting the parochial centrality of economy within Marxism had rendered power so powerful that the space for resistance seemed to shrink to a vanishing point. I'm so glad then to revisit the question of subject and structure in a new context after the long night of postmodern quietism and in a new era of global revolt marked by obvious bids for agency. I invoke the quote finally mindful of its circumstance. 1968 was the height of the rebel 60s and the immediate wake of the May uprisings in France. Sartre described its triumph as the liberation of the sense of the possible. It had seemed impossible, he observed, that the Vietnamese could resist such an enormous military, though this is what they did, completely changing the horizon of the students and others. They now knew that there were possibilities that remained unknown. Not that everything was possible, but that one can only know something is impossible once one has tried it and failed. This sentiment closely mirrors my own sense of what still makes the 60s so special. For an intoxicating spell, nothing seemed settled or sacred, rendering the era a giant experiment in the mutability of the human condition. My work has focused mostly on collectivities trying to reshape social structures, but today I focus on efforts to transform subjectivity, both as the means and ends of change. Indeed, one way of looking at the 60s is as an experiment in the mutability of the self, studded with extraordinary dramas of personal reinvention by which individuals strove to become something much greater than they were conditioned to be. In the American context, my concern today, this drama is most conspicuous among black radicals. Malcolm X literally converted, trading his identity as a hoodlum and his slave name for a pious life in opposition to white supremacy. Muhammad Ali converted as well, rejecting his designation as cannon fodder in a white man's war. Other religious people, notably the Berrigans, broke with the established church to embrace resistance to militarism as the fulfillment of the gospel. Among secular converts, there's Daniel Ellsberg, the Pentagon analyst turned anti-warrior. More consequential were the countless working-class soldiers who turned against the war and their own fate as cannon fodder. The counterculture shimmers with self-reinvention, whether Leary, the Harvard psychologist turned acid guru, and even when he was straight, he looked a little crazed. The Jewish kid from Worcester, Abby Hoffman, turned holy fool, and of course Minnesota's Robert Zimmerman, morphing into Greenwich Village's Bob Dylan. In a more political register, countless youths remade themselves as revolutionary socialists, urban and rural communards, black and white panthers, brown berets, and red guards. Pushing past the 60s, feminism entailed women rejecting prescribed roles as girlfriends, wives, mothers, and sex objects, and defiance of normative identity was even more pronounced in gay liberation. Finally, in a private drama repeated en masse, young people declared independence from their roots to birth new selves. With mythic grandeur, Roxanne Ortiz, later a movement diehard, opens her memoir, On New Year's Day in 1960, my husband and I packed our car aimed west on Route 66, headed for a new life in the paradise of every Oki's dream. As we left Oklahoma, I said a silent prayer to a God I barely believed in anymore. Lord, I will never return to this God-forsaken place. I am free. I have escaped. To be sure, Americans in the 60s did not invent self-reinvention. A nation of immigrants with near limitless frontiers and considerable opportunity, America has always teemed with such narratives, as Ortiz acknowledges. Nor was the generation of the 60s the last to revel in self-fashioning. Immigrant sagas continued. My era featured inspiring cultural changelings like Madonna and Prince, and I'll throw in Bowie for the sake of Simon, who expressed, he has a new book on Bowie, okay, who expressed the joyous side of postmodern bricolage. Our current president is famous for his efforts to overcome enormous economic and cultural barriers. Bohemians and dreamers questing in wanderlust still exist. Nonetheless, differences of quality and quantity distinguish the 60s. Never before in this society or since has self-transformation been invested with such intense political purpose. The abiding faith was that by changing yourself you change the world, and second, that changing oneself required critically engaging prevailing structures. Personal liberation demanded political resistance. Behind my inquiry into this formula stands enduring fascination with the question of how much freedom we possess to become who we want or feel we are meant to be. Approaching this abstractly is, I fear, fruitless, so I'd like to consider it historically, by looking at a time when faith in such freedom ran high. I identify in the 60s particular articulations of self-determination, coursing through three vital paradigms. I assess what proved promising or difficult as freedom hit limits, and I conclude by considering the legacy of the era's experiments in self-transformation. So the first category, authenticity. The quest for authenticity is a central part of the 60s, suffusing its signature texts, moments, and personalities. The Port Huron Statement, the founding manifesto of SDS, overflows with existential themes. It asserts that a great swath of the post-war generation had been maturing in complacency. Yet for many, this comfort was penetrated by conditions too troubling to dismiss, from nuclear war, the threat thereof, to racism and poverty. What's beneath these threats was the hobbling of the individual, unable to exercise, quote, determining influence over the circumstances of life. Technological rationality had rendered humans things to be manipulated with unfulfilled capacities for reason, freedom, love, self-cultivation, and creativity. Human independence, the statement declared, should be the goal of society in which everyone might, quote, find a meaning in life that is personally authentic. So this is the first great image of authenticity as a self-driven existence in accord with deeply held values. The origins of this sentiment in Jeffersonian liberalism, American pragmatism, and transcendentalism are well established, including by Jim Miller in his definitive history of the Port Huron Statement. Less often acknowledged is the importance of Christian existentialism. Starting in the late 50s, left-leaning Christian associations on campus preached personal integrity, wholeness, spiritual and worldly engagement, and the pursuit of the really real as the answers to alienation. The multiracial SNCC, so inspirational for SDS, first extolled the redemptive power of Christian love. For all such groups, the alienation of the individual stemmed from social estrangement. Hence, participatory democracy, the great medium of New Lex politics, served as both a crucible for self-realization and a way to accrue individual and collective power. So authenticity required community, and it soon involved confrontation. The 1964 Berkeley free speech movement combined existential demands with defiant action. The movement began in protest of the university barring students from even educating about struggles outside of campus, chiefly the civil rights movement. To the students, the prohibition amounted to the quarantine of conscience, cutting them off not just from the world, but from their own moral potential. Roiling the campus with takeovers and arrests, the movement received its hallmark oratory in Mario Savio's passionate call for those sick at heart to throw their bodies on the gears of a rapacious societal machine. In this, we see another iteration of authenticity as Camusian rebellion holding ground against perceived assaults on dignity and life. Public resistance to the draft, beginning around this time, further enacted this rebellion. As much bellwether as spark, the Berkeley movement was part of a surge of youths inveighing against an unreal world of superficial comforts and self-serving aspirations. The futures of students, Savio complained, are for the most part intellectual and moral wastelands. This chrome-plated consumer's paradise would have us grow up to be well-behaved children, but a minority have shown that they will die rather than be standardized, replaceable, and irrelevant. We have in some not a traditional revolt against a society that could not adequately provide means of subsistence, but rather which offered, even for its winners, a life not worth living. And that was the sort of formulation of the era. This creed may appear the conceit of privilege, serving to mask the more tangible deprivations that had hardly disappeared from American life, and to grace those well off with the mantle of oppression. And this skepticism is partly justified. But righteous personal defiance, hardly exclusive to the white middle class, often underwrote abjectly political, other-directed action. Members of the 1968 Columbia Uprising, instigated by the university's expansion into Harlem and ties to military research, proclaimed that the striking students are, quote, responding to the totality of our society, not just one small part. We are disgusted with war, with racism, and being part of a system we cannot control, which demands great inequalities of wealth and power and denies personal and social freedom. The university is a cog in this machine, a factory whose product is knowledge and personnel, us, useful to the system, end quote. For the students, liberation meant non-compliance with their socially necessary function for the sake of both themselves and others. There is, moreover, a profound sense in which relative affluence was not just the condition of possibility, but the progressive logic behind the hope for the emergence of free people in a free society. Marcuse, breaking with traditional Marxism and his Frankfurt School cohort, was the great theorist of this hope. According to him, advanced industrial society was distinguished by its productivity, prosperity, and apparent cohesion. That cohesion was based both in its literal ability to deliver the goods for so many people and to manage dissent by recuperating it or casting it to the margins. Such cohesion masked, however, the society's underlying irrationality. Above all, technological progress in the form of automation had reduced the need for alienated, exploitative toil to a minimum. In material terms, at least a portion of humanity was poised for the fabled passage within Marxism from the realm of necessity into the realm of freedom, when true human existence begins. This happy possibility met, though, a political barrier. The power structure worked to sustain the commodity system, division of labor, racial hierarchy, and military state apparatus from which it benefited. And it ruled more by consent than coercion in the mass appeal of needs and satisfactions permeated with the exigencies of profit, competitive performances, and standardized fun. The antidote was not the revolt of the masses, whom Marcuse thought complacent. Instead, it demanded the cultivation of a new sensibility among an enlightened minority. This sensibility rejected on moral and aesthetic grounds a system that retarded its own emancipatory potential and warped the self to meet its ends. This sense of being at a technologically induced threshold was not just the stuff of esoteric social theory. None other than Mick Jagger, when asked by a reporter in 1966 his thoughts on the youth culture, replied, "This isn't the first generation that has questioned the moral values of the last, but it's one of the first that hasn't had to worry about material things. If you're hungry, you haven't got much time to worry about morals, if fighting wars is right. If you're starched full of food, you can start worrying. People will worry more as they'll have less work to do. They'll have hardly any work because machines will do it for them, which is already happening. The rest of the time, they'll do something else." What? This reporter asked. "Well, it isn't going to be what people think, just jumping around, swimming, reading books, and going to the movies, because those things get boring very quickly." And here I suppose he shows his LSE education and his affinity for sophisticated ideas. Set aside the dubious assumption that morality begins only with a full belly. What is striking is Jagger's casual faith in the incipient emergence of new selves. The image is not of people winning back more of themselves through expanded leisure time, or even Marx's well-rounded individual who under socialism each day works, fishes, and philosophizes. Jagger doesn't name the future, he just believes in it. Marcuse, by contrast, was attuned to the system's tenacity. He thus praised the youth rabble for their refusal to grow up and perform for a society which compels the vast majority to earn their living in stupid, inhuman, and unnecessary jobs, conducts its booming business on the backs of colonialism, and utilizes its vast resources for destruction. In its positive movement, already present to him in hippie fashion, drug experiences, nudity, folk music, the transvaluing of linguistic and hygienic conventions, and the anarchic rejection of the bureaucratic organization of left-wing politics, The new sensibility pointed towards greater cooperation, playfulness, and joy. The end game was the merging of techne and art, making the work of social reproduction a gay science. And then he invokes the notion of the literalization of the Nietzschean figure of the gay science, to think of technology and social reproduction to be a joyous enterprise in which creativity and productivity emerge. It is impossible to say how many people embraced the politics of authenticity. And the counterculture was, of course, in part a mass commercial phenomenon. Many of its adherents were aware of how easily self-expression was commodified as lifestyle. And much subsequent analysis holds that the liberalization of social mores was necessary for the fruition of consumer capitalism. Bracketing this perspective, I want, however, for now to take seriously how seriously a critical mass took authenticity and its transformative promise. I'd now like to gauge another paradigm of dissident subjectivity I call performativity. It is best captured in the notion of life actor, promulgated by the Haight-Ashbury's diggers, who combine guerrilla theater protest and service to the community. The concept, in turn, is richly described by ex-digger turned Hollywood actor Peter Coyote in his memoir, Sleeping Where I Fall. And then he had a small part in E.T., and then all of the voice work for Apple products is Peter Coyote's probably the most employed, famous, and rich sort of voice actor in America today, and like a true hardcore hippie who lives in a spectacular house in Mill Valley. So his narrative is a happy one from a material standpoint. Okay, now life actor is a far more discriminating, even avant-garde approach to the self than authenticity. By the same token, it arguably has far greater resonance with respect to the means by which selves are actually constructed, and I'll explain. Coyote describes his life as a quest for self-creation that might both redeem the life of his father, an East European Jew who had failed to find happiness in the waspy world of East Coast suburban affluence, and to, quote, liberate others from the thrall of the dominant culture's prefabricated visions for them. Coyote's escape took him to California, where he joined the San Francisco Mime Troupe. The troupe was expert in the Italian commedia dell'arte tradition, an itinerant theater featuring the performance of archetypes through exaggerated gestures and melodrama. Updating the plays with contemporary themes, the troupe grew skilled both in the art of artifice and the emerging vogue of guerrilla theater. Radicals as well, their conviction was that art had been commodified, such that the triad of stage, performer, audience mirrored that of shopkeeper, and consumer. Making art transactional, such a relationship also encouraged passive spectatorship removed from the immediacy of the performance. But, quote, if you broke the glass of separation, people would stream in from the other side of the stage and become life actors. They would be free, that is, to play themselves. Behind this image of liberation was the idea that all the world is indeed a stage, with the self little more than the performance of socially scripted roles. And those roles, they insisted, left most of its actors unfulfilled. Theirs was an era lonesome for heroes in which people were taught to covet the achievements and adventures of others, like celebrities. Quote, further refinement of the life actor concept therefore required the conscious creation of a character, a persona for everyday life, who embodied one's highest social and spiritual aspirations. We wanted to imagine our most admirable self and act him or her out every day. In this way, each of us might become his or own hero, as well as an engine of social change. Authenticity, barely retained in this view, was to live in such convincing imitation of a self-generated aspiration that one's heroism became real. Marking his own rebirth, Coyote changed his last name to Coyote, inspired by an experience with the Native American sacrament peyote. Being a life actor was, however, easier said than done, threatened by two omnivorous desires in America, for money and for fame. The diggers therefore insisted that all performances be done for free, with the self remaining anonymous. In this way, they became shadowy ciphers in the Bay Area, staging hit-and-run happenings and providing food to any in need. In addition, they further developed the idea of free. Their thought, in hindsight somewhat naive, was that free could not be co-opted because it could not be monetized. And I remember listening to a brand specialist saying that free is just another price point, and then a sort of transmission belt into premium services. So that's the sense in which it's naive to think that free can't be monetized. Their thought, another contention was that one could live surprisingly easily off the detritus of the consumer society, if content to possess things that were not new. In their incisive, counterintuitive view, money and the need to work for it, not a literal scarcity of goods, created scarcity. To enact their critique, they founded a free store, pictured here. The intent was less to redistribute goods than have participants question their interpolation in roles like consumer. To the diggers, such a role implied the selfish appropriation of what they considered social wealth, created and owned by everybody. The political goal was the same as that for the fabricated self. Standing outside the dominant culture, Coyote wrote, and creating an alternative to it seemed achievable at the time. Visions of limitless possibilities inspired us, and as these visions unleashed potent imaginative force and affected actual behavior in others, they became real. How widely the diggers were imitated is impossible to say, but much as the spirit of the situation as seen everywhere in May '68, without much direct influence, the digger ethos abounded. Before their advent, Bob Dylan, fabulating his origins, sought to become and then exceeded his hero, Woody Guthrie. Ken Kesey, author of One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, was neighbor to the diggers in California. An all-American athlete, he next became a literary superstar, sparked by his participation in government-sponsored LSD experiments. Forswearing literature, he then played the part of the psychedelic superhero, proselytizing freak consciousness while co-starring in the 100-hour movie The Zonked Merry Pranksters made of their travels. Abby Hoffman confessed stealing for the yippies the diggers' concept of free. With less fanfare, free was an ideal of countless rural communes seeking through self-sufficiency release from the corruptions of money. The digger elan suffused as well countercultural communities as they blossomed most everywhere. Of this bloom, Coyote wrote, "Young people from other cultures than my own appeared, creating new standards of beauty. Excluded or freed from the corny, belted Ivy League uniforms of 50s corporate culture, they began acting out archetypal identities from their cultural traditions, letting their hair grow, using their bodies as canvas, their clothing as paint, reinventing language, music, art, and theater. One might encounter endearing facsimiles of the Lone Ranger, Arthur Conan Doyle, or Geronimo parading their fantasy down the boulevard. Freshly minted or reminted models of being, once expressed in the flesh, became the basis for emulation and refinement by others." With greater edge, Andy Warhol's New York scene, in which everybody was fabulous, everybody a star, reveled in drag and imagecraft. I've moved briskly from politics to culture, and it may seem, from the serious to the superficial. But here again, a note of caution. Based on countless testimonials, many people experience such self-fashioning as a great rush of freedom, at the heart of their affection for the times. Moreover, I wish to stress by emphasis on literal costuming that new identities are never created ex nihilo. Rather, they draw on pre-existing archetypes, symbols, and styles. And this pastiche, whether to form the patchwork of the inner or outer self, very much existed within a pop sensibility, stitching together deep-rooted myth and mass culture alike. Last, this aspect of costuming leads back to politics, in the sense that new identities were commonly constructed through identification under the banner of solidarity with real and imagined others. Rimbaud's famous phrase, "I am another," had captured the constitutive alienation of the modernist subject. But now, in an era of intense politicization and emerging postmodernism, the hope was to overcome alienation by becoming like or standing with another. Which brings me to solidarity. Overwhelmingly, the identity categories through which solidarity operated in the 60s were racial, ethnic, and national. And arguably the most important solidarity was the intra-group solidarity tinged with authenticity of American blacks. The black freedom struggle took as a premise the psychic damage of white supremacy, whereby the self-worth of blacks depended on their ability to rank within the white world. Elaine Brown, raised in poverty but later placed in elite white schools, gave aching description of this. "There seemed to be a promise at school," she wrote. "It was not the victory of hitting a number or the success of stealing a new dress or a decent piece of meat for dinner. It was bigger than my mother's dreams, a promise with wings that would take me away forever and plant me in the security of the white world." Very heartbreaking. Here, escape is the denial and not the discovery of oneself. For the civil rights movement, the bid for full personhood was the answer to the anguish of separate but equal and the tokenism for the talented 10th. The Black Power movement, which Brown soon joined, and her transformation is remarkable, denied the need for white society to confer in a scheme it had no right to withhold. Authenticity was to reject both deference to white norms and aspirations to inclusion, and celebrate instead the distinctiveness of black identity. This entailed new performative repertoires to signify a new kind of black personhood, grounded in an appreciation of the African American past. By obvious example, the Black Panthers cultivated a potent image of militancy and pride. I should add that members of Philadelphia's MOVE organization, in daring self-reinvention, lived communally, each took the name Africa, renounced personal property, left their hair uncut and their children unclothed, and armed themselves. And they were, of course, massacred in Philadelphia in 1985, Robin? Yeah, I mean, so there's limits to what's permissible in terms of self-reinvention for certain categories of others. The Black Campus movement, in which activists literally died agitating for black-centered curricula, speaks to the importance of cultural knowledge and a usable past for self-determination. Inspired by the black struggle, other groups followed suit, creating the rainbow of black, brown, red, and yellow power. This group solidarity spurred solidarity across group lines. African Americans looked to Black Africa for anti-colonial partners and affirmation of their roots. White politicos sought alliance with the black struggle, first through interracial activism and later by organizing their own communities against racism, while often exalting black radicalism as the vanguard of political struggle in the U.S. Such solidarity was partly an effort to disclaim or overcome one's whiteness and its privilege. Similarly, crafting an anti-imperialist subjectivity could mean support for and identification with Latin American revolutionaries, typified by sending Venceremos brigades to Cuba to cut sugarcane, and of course the adulation of Che Guevara. U.S. radicals of all stripes looked to South Asian socialism as an alternative modernity. This prompted pilgrimages to North Vietnam, China, and even North Korea, and I have some of the images here, where the hosts were regarded as exemplars of new men and women. Any of these identifications could entail taking on foreign dress and customs, converting to alien ideologies, and parroting the speech, as in the recitation of Maoist doctrine as political catechism, of various others. Self-reinvention was relational, in other words, often based in political imperatives. So that covers the three paradigms, and now I want to sort of assess their success and failure, as per Sartre. You know, when you learn what is and isn't possible when possibility emerges as a category of experience. Any ground accounting of the era's experiments in the mutability of the self lies beyond my consideration today, requiring suggestive conclusions and culture critique by associative shorthand. I begin with the achievements. In pursuit of authenticity, countless lives were lived with greater intensity, honesty, willfulness, and risk than societal expectations had dictated. This desire for elevated purpose and meaning underwrote so much of the era's push for equality, freedom, and justice in all realms of social activism. I wonder for my own times what will be possible if millions of people with the audacity of youth defended a right and an obligation to live in accord with deeply held values. So too an ethic of solidarity demanded consciousness of the structural dimensions of subjectivity and the effort to reach beyond oneself to engage the lives, or at least the struggles, of others. The desire to radically remake the self, in short, was a great driver of whatever the 60s accomplished. Equally instructive are the ways in which self-transformation misfired, whether by failing to create better selves or truly alter social structures. And this begins my sort of recitation of the limits. For starters, authenticity could encourage self-purification through moral witness with only secondary consideration to political efficacy. So too, going back to the land could mean retreat from active struggle with the social conditions prompting the very pursuit of an alternative. At another extreme, some militants exalted risk, confrontation, and violence as the measures of political authenticity and moral commitment. A consequence was to reproduce the authoritarianism and militarism of the dominant culture. For their part, black radicals often equated militancy with authentic black identity, discouraging alliance with civil rights liberals and limiting the reach of black power, including among blacks. Solidarity, moreover, could be based in reified understandings of race and nation. One result was reductive assumptions of what the blacks, the Vietnamese, Cubans, the Cubans, really wanted or needed, as if complex social entities had a unitary will mandating a single expression of solidarity. A second problem was the idealization of the other through an inversion of normative hierarchies. A poignant example is disclosed in a new study of the journeys of American activists to enemy South Asia. A 1969 anti-imperialist delegation learned firsthand the suffering the U.S. had caused such peoples, but their sympathy was studded with ludicrous praise for China's Cultural Revolution and even for North Korea as a workers' and a feminist paradise. Finally, solidarity can encourage overstrong identifications that terribly conflated context. Some U.S. radicals, remaking themselves as guerrillas, looked to armed struggles in the Third World as models for revolution at home, and that was clearly futile. The cultural side of self-reinvention had its own hazards, for which the experience of the diggers is telling. Their life actor concept required commitment to one's ideal self no matter the cost, and this was the militancy of their commitment. Absent sacrifice and moral devotion, the hippiedom around them often devolved into hedonism, vulnerable to corporate and illicit profiteers and even one's own avarice. Further, as Coyote somewhat humorously acknowledges, the group was beset by contradictions indicating how hard it was to escape society's dominant logics. Hip patrons soon showered the group with money by virtue of its reputation for wanting them. Fame also was hard to avoid. Raised in a working-class Brooklyn environment, Emmett Grogan was the quintessential digger, mysterious and charismatic. He wanted, however, not merely to be a life actor, but a star, allowing anyone to freely use his name, and people could run around saying, "I'm Emmett Grogan, I'm Emmett Grogan." He grew famous as a meme in the Bay Area for a time, which he privately relished. In addition, he approached his life as an improvised legend, making it impossible for friends of his like Coyote to discern legend and outright lies from truth, fraying basic trust. And I feel like we all know that person, the person who lives in sort of mythic register, and they're, charismatic and infuriating because you never know, like, what is for real, and then, issues of personal integrity often come up. Finally, the burdens of a dissipated self led Grogan to seek a kind of ballast in heroin, which claimed him at a young age. The freedom to create oneself came also with the license to destroy oneself, which the digger ethos and broader counterculture had little capacity to temper. Free had its own corrosive potential. If, as Coyote observed, everything is a ripoff, the economy one giant scam, then one is free to take anything from anybody, justified as a personal expropriation of ill-gotten gains. All the countercultural scenes in which he participated struggled with theft, including in their own ranks. Similarly, if the work ethic is denigrated as social programming and responsibility a mere hang-up, obligations to community can be shirked. Coyote cursed unusably filthy dishes as the bane of every commune, while observing that so often the women bottom-lined, as per custom, domestic order and child-rearing. Last, transgression could become an end in itself, supported by dangerous identifications and myths. Coyote nearly joined the Hells Angels before realizing that these outlaws were mostly interested in macho power plays and the hippies' drugs, booze, and women. Such cautionary tales had ample echoes. In the ruin of so many of the era's rock stars seeking escape from the demigod status they had colluded in creating, and the anonymous lives gone adrift in hazes of drugs and rootless self-discovery. And then apropos, the last episode of Mad Men had Roger's daughter living in a commune and abandoning her 4-year-old daughter, and then very, tender and historically sort of sensitive, portrait of the perils of that attempt of hers to, separate from, the trauma of her childhood and sort of become herself. Okay, so, other sort of perils. And the ego trips of countercultural icons like Jerry Rubin or crazed tyrants like Charles Manson, and in the families, childhoods, and communities shattered by the professed need of partners and guardians to do their own thing. Especially resident is Ken Kesey, who respun his life as a rebel epic, taking him for a time to Mexico as a fugitive for a marijuana bust. Late in life, and in this book, The Demon Box, he accepted a judge's description of him as, quote, a tarnished Galahad, concluding that he had betrayed his wife, his children, the asylum subjects of his famous first novel, and his own literary gifts. So a guy lonesome for heroes ends up becoming a sad and lonely hero. Kesey's fate illustrates the danger that one becomes captive to and even haunted by one's own myth. In the realm of politics, the Black Panther Huey Newton grew to disdain the famous picture of him perched like some African warrior king in a wicker chair holding a spear and a rifle. And late in his career, he tried to reestablish the Panthers as a nonviolent community organization. With deliberate absurdity, the ex-weatherman Mark Rudd, and he's one of my crony 60s friends, titled a 2004 essay, "Shay and Me." In it, he describes wanting as a college student at Columbia to be like the gun-toting poet, so much so that he became an improbable American guerrilla, destined like Shay for literal martyrdom. Only much later did the Jewish Rudd realize that he had been enthralled by the ancient patriarchal archetype of a male hero bearing emancipation and whose violent sacrifice promises redemption. Sound familiar? Rudd's own bid for rebirth aligned him with a myth whose dimensions he did not even understand at the time, and which broke in our Christian culture, in fact, no new ground. A related problem was the damage done to others in the fabrication of one's liberated self. Philip Deloria finds devastating evidence of this in the relationship of the counterculture to Native Americans. Deloria observes that Euro-Americans had since colonial days adopted positive associations of Indianness and played Indian, as in the Boston Tea Party, to advance particular interests, even as they routed native peoples. Venerating Indians' alleged simplicity, harmony with nature, and noble defiance, the 60s counterculture famously adopted elements of Indian dress, custom, and spiritualism. Yet this professed affinity was seldom based in contact with actual Indians, nor did minimal justice to the complexities of Indian culture. Deloria locates this appropriation in part in the evolving postmodern condition, defined by the separation of images from their referent. No longer rooted in tangible collective experience, Indianness became a free-floating signifier, or set of them, ripe for plucking for one's own ends. And with stinging irony, young whites invoke a vacuous Indianness precisely to ground themselves in earthy meaning, and this is the great irony of authenticity. Even the perspicacious coyote was not immune. Such appropriations were hardly exclusive to North Americans. Middle-class Mexicans, as Eric Zoloft records, essentially imitated American hippies' imitation of native Mesoamericans so as to commune with their pre-colonial roots. Nor were Indians the only group used this way. The 60s teems with dubious constructions of the indigenous, the third world peasant, the organic intellectual, the tantric yogi, pictured here as emblems of authenticity. A fine line, in short, separated solidarity and its identifications from appropriation and its mystifications of the other. To return now to Sartre's imagery, free thinkers and bold doers worked in the 60s to expand that normally small space in which one may be more than one's conditioning. That space, however, shrank as self-reinvention spurred some to try to become something and someone they were not. The self proved elastic, but not infinitely so. But what of subjectivity today and possibilities for its expansion? And this is the free association culture critique part. What from the 60s may survive as invitation or inspiration? At first blush, very little. In an age of irony, authenticity may appear impossibly earnest or quaint. On the campuses where it once raged, smart people long ago retired the concept with the conviction that there was no essential self or humanity from which to be estranged and with which one might reunite. Judith Butler's seismic insight that gender, if not subjectivity writ large, are performative, pushed the ship of authenticity past seeming return. Might, however, the idea of life actor be salvageable? It dispenses, after all, with the essential self and asks only that we be true to a projective ideal. Here the danger is less in being outmoded than overexposed. The digital age has meant the proliferation of technologies for relentless self-documentation and viral self-generated fame. The notion that we are perpetually playing ourselves is now all but a given, with reality just another referential medium. Stardom has hardly been elevated by being made more democratic. Reality TV stars are not just famous for being famous, worse, their key role is to perform with knowing exaggeration the degraded tropes of celebrity itself: vanity, entitlement, melodrama, and vapid charm. And I should say that as sort of after-image of authenticity, a variation celebrates a contrived, unself-conscious quirkiness to make anti-glamour new chic. And think of Honey Boo Boo, which I've never seen, and Duck Dynasty, which sadly I have. The result is a mimesis of fame to which countless people sadly aspire. further, the smartphone has emerged as the quintessential catalyst for the digital assemblage that becomes you. It holds your music, your apps, your contacts, friends, followers, networks, tweets, texts, tasks, and images. With some grumbling, social convention permits in public space being totally lost in your own private digital world, and we all know the phenomena. This is the new right to be oneself. Advertising screams your power to fashion your unique constellation as free services like Spotify, bankrupting actual artists, infinitely expand the field of choice. Meanwhile, big data crunches you into a nanotype, ripe for shrewdly targeted marketing you may scarcely notice. Better living through algorithms. With self-fashioning sans social friction now ubiquitous, rebellion suffers as well. It has long been observed that rebellion is now a cultural dominant, held by every brand merchant. In A Nation of Outsiders, Grace Hale provides an astute take on this. For her, the iconic Catcher in the Rye was a fateful moment in post-war culture, wherein the complaint of inner alienation came to supplant concern for the material social marginalization of minorities, the poor, and other have-nots. The result, a decade later, is what she calls the Donut Society, with most everyone claiming outsider status at the non-conforming margins. Who is left to worry about the center, the common weal, the public, and the public good? This posture, she notes, is now equally one of the right, waging a permanent insurgency under the victim of mantlehood. And for all their populist claims, Occupy enthusiasts themselves risk fetishizing their own contrarian views and insurgent subcultures. Solidarity may be in greatest disrepair. With rare exceptions, frank talk about race is dismissed as divisive, while a dysfunctional Congress paralyzes even modest dreams of earned citizenship, requiring unimpeachable compliance with assimilationist norms. The gods of the rebel 60s, one may imagine, are now weeping, newly aware of what they were up against, while also perhaps conscious of what they, in their naivete and zeal, had wrought. But despair is its own distorting ideology. In this spirit, one may observe that rumors of authenticity's death have been exaggerated. Its continued life animates the great, if incomplete, social revolution of our time, the unprecedented freedom gay people have to be gay in an open way, to work where they want, while out, and have their love pay the highest public honor. It is, of course, with great irony that authenticity may be associated with queerness. Queer people all along have been most aware of performativity, revealing straightness, even for straight people, as another kind of drag. Though this is changing some, gay culture has been less about performing some gay norm than reveling in costuming and the send-up of archetypes, bending gender with reflexive jouissance. The enduring place of authenticity came to me, like a flash, listening to a 4-star general a few years back explain why Don't Ask, Don't Tell had to be repealed. It was un-American, he intoned, to force someone to pretend to be something they are not. One may see a retrograde assumption of a gay essence in the declaration of a right to the outer expression of one's inner self. But in a redemptive Butlerian twist, the general suggests that absent public performance, gayness might as well not exist. A similar dynamic may one day lift the undocumented out of the shadow of self-falsification. And that's an interesting argument for the DREAM Act. You should not have to pretend you have a status that you don't have. And maybe authenticity could be a viable discursive strategy. Further hope may be found in despair. Young people, especially raised in a world of together alone, or alone together, increasingly recognize that connectivity does not always equal connection and yearn for community. However, relying on social media, Occupy reveal the depth of this desire for embodied interaction and democratic exchange. So too many young people express exhaustion with the work of maintaining all of their virtual avatars, felt to be significant representations of, but not the definitive gestalt of themselves. At the edges, there are experiments with anonymity as a salve against cheap, ubiquitous fame. And there's one little anecdote, like I came here in 2008, right after the first occupation, when Holy Hell descended on 14th Street, and then Neil had asked me to meet with one of the occupiers, and then he was a young guy, in my office, like quickly dissolved into tears, and was trying to explain the occupation of, an abandoned building that almost got them killed. He felt that way at the time, and he said he wanted to do something that couldn't be reduced to an emoticon. Okay, so he sort of reveled in the kind of unintelligibility or inscrutability.
Emoticon.
He wanted to do something. He wanted,
Like
as
little
part of his
symbols
generation, to
he
do
used
something to be reduced to an emoticon. It didn't have a transparent, instantaneously sort of, commutable, meaning. Okay. Finally, and closer to worry than hope, we may not have the option not to change ourselves in enlightened ways. So much of the Diggers' work was to create situations that would force participants to think about their naturalized assumptions, behaviors, and their consequences. So for the Diggers, like, individual choices were important. The underlying image, as Coyote expressed it, was this: that as the result of 1,000 individual choices, each seemingly innocent, you will one day stand before the cultural mall that is America and ask yourself how and for what purpose it was built. By analogy, there was growing recognition among those concerned with climate change that not just our current energy policy, but our entire way of life is unsustainable. We must therefore untie and rethread the very fabric of our existence, some believe, including the self. With prophetic warning, a friend of mine who recently died, pictured here, spoke to just this. The man was Paul Mayer, a Jew from Germany whose family had escaped the Holocaust, and then interestingly his father went to the same synagogue as Henry Kissinger. And there was a famous trial in, I believe, 1971 for the Milwaukee 14, where the Berrigans, pacifists, were accused of trying to wire the White House with dynamite. And then Mayer, a supporter of theirs, was in the audience, and then at one point revealed his Jewish lineage and accused the judge of being, a little Hitler or something like that. Okay, so this is Paul Mayer. The man was Paul Mayer, a Jew from Germany whose family escaped the Holocaust. While in the United States, he converted to Catholicism and joined a monastery. There he met the Berrigan priests, soon joining them in resistance to war and poverty. Late in life, he devoted himself to ecology and the rights of the indigenous. At his memorial, attendees were given quotes of his to frame his legacy. The one I received, while deep in preparation of an academic talk on self-transformation, was this: what history is calling for is nothing less than the creation of a new human being. We must literally reinvent ourselves through the alchemy of the spirit or perish. I'll end with that quote and leave this image up as something to ponder. Thank you. Okay. So there's.
Jeremy, you want to take your own questions?
I will take my.